As the 2020s came to a close, the British Isles were in a relatively peaceful state. Out of the ashes of the war that had plunged the old world into chaos, new states had arisen, and although some of their ideologies may have conflicted, actual war was rather rare. But what none of them could have known was that in only a few short years they would be plunged into one of the bloodiest conflicts the post-event world had ever seen. The road to war began in the year 2030, under the rule of newly elected Prime Minister Winston Smith Jr. Oceania was beginning the path towards reindustrialization, with the first newly made steam engines being put to use in various industries. But for engines, you need fuel, and that was something the lands held by Oceania were sorely lacking in. However, just outside the border, the lands that had once been held by the British county of Lincolnshire held some of the largest coal deposits in the Isles. With this in mind, an expedition was sent into the lands in order to survey its state and potential for subjugation. The inner party could never have guessed what happened next. The people of Lincolnshire were proud, were independent. They didn't want anything to do with Oceania. As it turned out, neither did the Scouts. Upon being confronted by the people of Lincolnshire, they almost immediately surrendered, defecting from Oceania once and for all. This was disturbing news for the inner party. After all, if they could defect, if they could escape from the watchful eye of Big Brother, what would stop others from doing the same? A troop of soldiers were sent after the defectors, with orders to find and capture and execute the rebels, making an example of them to all of Oceania. Unfortunately for the party, that is not what happened at all. Instead of killing the defectors, the soldiers joined them, killing their commanding officers. But they knew that nonetheless, if they didn't escape, if they didn't get help soon, then they were doomed. That help came in the form of the Cooperative, a union of communities to the north of Oceania. Although it took much debate, they finally chose to aid the defectors, taking them in and providing support for their cause. Thus began the bloodiest and most brutal war seen in the Isles for decades. But while a few members of Oceania's populace were against the Ingsoc regime, the same could not be said for the majority. The recently invented concept of doublethink gripped Oceania like a plague, its citizens fanatically believing every word of the party. And thus, when co-op scouts first began to appear at the northern frontiers of Oceania, furious mobs of proles attacked them, murdering every last one. Thus began the march north. Under the leadership of General William Owles, 5,500 Oceanian troops marched into co-op territory, making a beeline for Manchester, capital of the Cooperative. Unwilling to come into direct conflict with the army, most of the co-op troops instead focused on evacuating civilians. Nonetheless, a few stayed behind and were promptly killed by furious Oceanian soldiers, in some cases being quite literally torn apart. As news of this spread to Leeds, additional co-op soldiers under the leadership of General Emmanuel Goldstein were sent to reinforce Manchester, constructing sandbags and trenches in anticipation of Owles's forces. It wasn't enough. Oceania's massive war-rabid troops lined the outside walls of the city. Although Goldstein's defensive forces were able to score quite a few kills, a solid barrage from Owles's artillery brought down the city walls, soon stormed by Oceanian troops. Captured citizens were sold into slavery, whilst Goldstein was captured and sent back to London in chains. It was clear now that the co-op was losing the war. On their own, its strategies and tactics had proven ineffective against the Oceanian onslaught. Thus it was that they sent for help from the other nations of Britain, none of whom were exactly hoping for an Oceanian victory. It was this that led to the creation of the Manchester Pact, an alliance of the Cooperative, the Kingdom of New Alba, and the Commonwealth of Wales, each pledging troops to aid in the war effort. But in Oceania, too, things were changing. With the realization of the vulnerability of their position, a mass mobilization effort was put into place, leading to the doubling of the size of their military, albeit with mostly badly trained and badly armed recruits. With the allies of the co-op unified, and Oceania's ravenous new army gathered, both sides were confident. All the same, the Manchester Pact clearly held the advantage, and it was up to General Oles to win the war once and for all, lest he be wiped from existence. This would lead to the second phase of the war, one even more brutal and terrible than the first. To be continued.